already said that this is the second missionary of Apostle Paul. And the verse 4, let's look at the verse 4 coming. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. That was what Apostle Paul was doing every Sabbath. Even before this chapter, you see that last week, how many of you were here last week? Very good. You remember Pastor was preaching on the book of Acts. I was listening to it and he was talking about Acts chapter 17, the time that the verse 19, when Paul was brought before Areopagus and they were saying that we want to hear this new teaching that Paul is advocating. And Paul was not advocating any new teaching. He was only telling them that Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. So Paul was not teaching any new thing. He was only advocating. And Paul understood from the onset that this is what I have been called to do. We will come to what I define as faithfulness or being faithful. So Paul was advocating what was handed over to him or what he was called to do. So they called Paul, we want to hear this new teaching. And Paul said, well, I'm not teaching anything new. Initially, what Paul was doing in Galatians chapter 1, the verse number 14, was that he was fighting Christians because they were all holding on to the traditions of their ancestors, which was Judaism. And we will see that all these persecution that Paul was going through, the people were attacking Paul because they thought Paul was teaching something new, which is contrary to what they knew. So Paul left Athens because the believers there sent Paul away. They wanted to kill Paul, thinking that Paul is preaching something new, but that was not it. So Paul left Timothy and Silas in Athens, and he came to Corinth because they wanted to kill him. That Paul, you are preaching something new, but Paul was not preaching something new. What Paul was doing is that this is what the Lord has called me to do, and I want to be faithful in my generation by giving expression to it. That is what Paul was doing. This is what, look at the verse 4 again. Let's look at the verse 4. It said, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Trying to persuade them. And why was he persuading them? He was telling them that Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. Everything that was said about Jesus in the Old Testament, he has fulfilled it in our days and in our time. But these men would then listen to Paul, and they